Okay. So there's always this thought of, should I go back to corporate career? Should I not? And things have come up that's been interesting. Corporate career? Yeah, about 4 to 5 years now. Yeah. So it's just a pinging question in my head. Yeah. So that's why I'm here, just kind of exploring. I have, but I also kind of just somehow actually in my corporate career days, every time the stars just aligned and you just get the role that you want and love, and then since I've left 5 years ago, I only like very few roles in the first place, and then whenever I apply, like something just doesn't end up working. And so I also have the spiritual side where I feel like the universe has a plan for me. When do I just let go of the corporate side and like really find the courage to do something on my own, and being able to just, I guess, have to transform internally to become an entrepreneur and make other decisions that are, yeah. So there's lots underneath there, yeah.
Before you arrived, we were talking about this.
Okay.
My assertion is that a lot of people who have spent time out of the workforce for whatever reason, they try to re-enter and it doesn't work. So that's actually a source of entrepreneurship, much like you're mentioning. And they're like, oh, yeah, I can't make my way back into the workforce, so I guess I'm going to start a business because obviously I still have skills and I don't want to go back to school, which is a path in, and I'm not finding a role that's exciting to me, so time to build that role. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
While you were talking, you said the exact same thing. Yeah. While you were talking, you had said the exact same thing that I had told them a few minutes ago, yeah. Or very similar, very parallel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, like, how do you really, like, I guess individually, I want to understand your like, own experience, like internal experience of almost like having faith.
I'll speak to that. So just before you arrived, I mentioned to them that if at like 15 minutes in we don't have 8 people, I'm gonna end the session at this point. Hey, thanks for the spare mic. And until then, I figured we might as well start having a conversation. And, it was going to be a facilitated conversation anyway. But your question of how do you maintain the internal both discipline, in my words, and also the perspective of optimism and faith, that there is that job out there that you want, or there is that ability to re-enter the workforce in a way where you can take all the skill you have and bring it. Right? For me, I'll speak more about this at Failure Night tonight, but I've been part of the 2 of the top 5 largest bankruptcies of all time. Okay. MCI WorldCom in the 2002, I was laid off from MCI WorldCom, and then in 2008, I was laid off from Washington Mutual, the bank. And both of those were huge. Yes. Shortly before, they each went bankrupt. And after the second one, I thought, no, I'm done with the tech world. I'm going to go do something else. And I took a hobby and I made it my job. Mm-hmm. So I started teaching partner dance, traveling the world, teaching, promoting, running dances in Seattle and the Bay Area. And I did that for 7 years. Mm-hmm. And after having an incredibly transformative role, introducing, so far my number is 8 couples who have gone on to get married. One of my very favorite statistics. And every day, my range in my work went from neutral to life-changing. And that was coming from IT, where that same range that I worked through on a daily basis was from terrible up to like maybe slightly beneficial, just like 1/2 step over that line. But there was no transformation in any of the work that I was doing. I was like, this is not changing my life. Please, pull up a chair, Jonas. This is not changing the lives of the people that I serve, and I keep getting laid off, and these companies are going bankrupt because they're corrupt anyway. So what's the benefit of this to me? And like, no, I'm done. I'm out. Yeah. And after running around changing lives for a while, I was living in the Bay Area and working as an artist, and realized that I was never going to be able to afford a home on that path. Not in the Bay Area, and maybe not anywhere. So I decided to sell my business. I'd also accomplished all the goals that I set out for myself when I started. I sold my business, and I started looking for something that brought together the decade of engineering experience that I had and the 7 years of working with people, doing teaching and transformation work for humans and organizing teams together into one role. And I settled onto a couple of different roles that I was looking for. Technical account manager and sales engineer, or both that marriage of technical skill and people work. And then I spent a year and a half looking for the role at a company that I believed in. Okay. It was a short enough list of companies and a big enough sell to convince them that my 7 years out of technology was going to serve them. That it took me quite a while. And it was also challenged because that was a year that I lost my mom and a dear love of mine who committed suicide, and my last remaining and favorite grandparent passed away, and my best friend had a serious health scare. So I had 4 major grief life events at the same time that I'm trying to keep that faith. So it was an uphill battle. Yeah. And the thing that I kept coming back to was, I know that this time away from technology is benefiting the companies any company that I might ultimately work for. Mm-hmm. It has made me a more robust human, a more competent leader, and a more grounded man. Yeah. And that couldn't possibly do anything other than benefit a company. Yeah, yeah. So I had that like little touchstone for myself of, I know this is going to help. And then it was just a matter of figuring out how to connect that internal reality to the company that I was talking to. And we also talked about this earlier, how do you represent the things that you're doing on a resume in a way that reads to whoever's looking at it? Yeah. Right? So there was also taking some of the skills that I was doing, some of the roles that I was filling as I was running my own business, and framing them in the context of the resume that I was using.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So I was running a small business, and as I was doing that, I was also periodically helping doing business transformation, because I've done IT for 30 years now, right? And I have been helping other companies do IT transformations as technology has changed. And even while I was gallivanting around teaching dance around the world, I still kept my tech skills up and helped companies do that from a consulting perspective. So I emphasized that work that I was doing, even though it was periodic, more heavily on my resume, and de-emphasized the business that I ran, which was actually much more interesting to me and much more formative in terms of who I am now as a leader, because it was a more clear story for the people from the tech companies who were looking at the resumes.
Got it. Would you say that your resume was more of a tool to get you in front of people to where you could have that conversation?
I think it always is.
Yeah, that's what. I just want to go get coffee. We don't need a resume. If the email didn't do it, we don't have to get coffee.
Yeah, and at a certain size, that breaks down. There are several layers between you and whoever, and part of the game now, I think, is the game for finding work is always, who do you know?
Yeah.
And if the resume isn't important to having that first conversation with a hiring manager, then there's no need to fine-tune or tweak, because they already see how valuable you are as a person.
Yeah. Okay. So the resume was really merely just you would doctor it as a getting in the door tactic.
It's a conversation starter.
Okay.
Yeah.
An icebreaker.
Yeah.
Okay.
And nothing was untrue. It's just a matter of which true things do I emphasize.
What percentage of your time would you say you spent teaching dance versus doing IT consulting? It's
like any entrepreneur. I have 4 or 5 jobs, and which 3 of them am I working today?
Yeah.
And so if on a given week, I'd probably spend 20 hours a week on IT things, and I'd probably spend 50 or 60 hours a week on running a business and teaching and running venues.
Yeah.
So I work way more as a small business owner than I have ever worked as an employee of a company.
And were you marketing yourself in terms of consulting?
Not really. I was really just helping friends with their businesses because that filled the amount of time and gave me the amount of dollars that I wanted out of that role. Mm-hmm. And I'm an engineer at heart. I like solving problems. And if I don't have a problem to solve, then I'm going to look around to find one so that, because I'm doing people work. Like, as satisfying as people work is and as transformative as it is, it's never capital D done. And there's no like solved. So I really like having problems where once it is working, it is unequivocally done. There's no question. That's great about math. That's great about like software and engineering problems for me. And even when it's something small like that, I'm going to find that quality of problem in my life so that when I go back to the messy problems, I still get the dopamine hits of having won.
Would you say there's a qualifying event that really directed you towards saying like, hey, after 7 years, I'm going to dive back in, whether it takes 2 years or a year, however long it takes, this is what I want to do? Or was it messier than that or more gray?
There were 2 things. When I started, I moved from engineering to teaching dance as a profession, and I set a number of goals for myself. And that 7th year, I ticked off the last goals. I was teaching at world-class events. I was traveling and teaching 80% of the time. I was running a successful business in the Bay Area with weekly venues and monthly classes. And I had an incredible partnership with Ruby, who's a dancer in Chicago with whom I traveled and taught all over the world. And I thought, this is now time. Do I start a new chapter of my relationship with this? Or do I step away and start a new project? And at the same time, I had 2 different community members approach me and say, hey, we think that this should be a community-run endeavor and would like to take it over. And I said, great, make me an offer. Talk to this other guy. And between the 2 of them, they formed a group of folks who ended up buying the business from me, turning it into a nonprofit. And that was my out to like put a pin in that chapter and start a new thing.
Could you share a couple of moments throughout that year and a half when you started searching, when you may have been discouraged or thought, I don't know if I need to go back and do this. I clearly can start a business on my own and do my own thing and with something that I love. How did you overcome those moments, or what were those moments like when you thought maybe this isn't the right move? And anyone else can jump in. I'm not interviewing him.
We just happen to have green chairs, but like this is a... Yeah, before you got here, I mentioned that in that year I had 3 significant deaths. And a big part of those stumbling blocks along the way for me was, what does this even matter? Why am I spending time thinking about what kind of work I'm doing in the world when it felt like every couple of months one of the most important people in my life was passing away. My stumbling blocks were more like, why does this work thing even matter? Why are we wasting time on this when I could be with some of those people who I love? It was very real, that sense of we could lose anyone we care about at any point. Because it kept happening. I was like, what do I... And each of those, also for me, when I'm grieving, it's really hard for me to accomplish anything. Like detail-oriented or scheduling-based, any deliverables, all the things that most of my professional skills are built around. Most of the ways I spend my personal time organizing and creating events, crafting high-quality experiences, all the skills behind those are just like shelved while the grief is processing. In between those times, of course, I was like job hunting, in my experience, is like shouting into the void, and occasionally hearing back. Like working hard to get excited about a company who I believe in, whose mission I want to support, and then crafting a cover letter and a resume and finding people internally, and then hearing nothing, and doing that again and again and again and again for months.
I'm assuming your motivation was beyond financial.
Yeah.
Were there any notable motivations for wanting to go back to more organizational, structured work?
Yeah, a big one for me is that I saw the tip of change coming in a cultural shift that I think that we've continued to see in terms of what kind of organizations we want to support and be a part of, what kind of leadership we are excited about, and I have the privilege to be able to walk into a room full of people, and I do it now in the context of my role, whether they're engineers or directors or C-suite, and to have a seat at that table. And I thought, as the social groups that I'm a part of and the organizations that I'm a member of in my personal life are looking for change and new dynamics in terms of leadership, I want to be part of that shift in the corporate world as well. Because I think the reason people are calling for it socially is because they want it globally. And I don't want to wait for the long transition from a social change trickling up through corporations into leadership, into government, into world politics. I want to shortcut that process.
Was step one identifying the type of organization that you would want to be involved with, or something that you could support?
Yeah, I had to care about what they were doing. I wanted to believe in the mission. I wanted there to be social change of some sort, right? Leadership that I believed in, and a company that harbored values that I shared. And that list was unfortunately short.
Yeah.
Yeah. Plus a kind of work that I actually can bring to the table. So, bringing those 4 tenets together left me with a relatively short list, and I feel really lucky to have found my way to a company that I do truly believe in. It's unfortunately not as much social impact as I would like in a direct way, but a huge environmental impact. Yeah. Well, I want to shift the conversation a little bit and open it up. Right. No. Maybe someday.
Maybe.
That.
By the end of the year, we're at 140.
We've been talking a little bit about my path, and I'd like, because this is intended to be a facilitated conversation and not my story, I'd love to hear from those of you all who've trickled in about your interest in the topic, and maybe to reset where the conversation is.
Can we do it without the mics?
They're recording, so the mics are to support the recording. If you don't want to use one, that's okay, but it is for the benefit of the recording, and they would appreciate it if you had it.
If we are opening it up, let's have a conversation. Like everybody would hear. Who's not there? Is there privacy, I guess?
Well, my suspension of disbelief is impeccable, so I can have a personal conversation while I'm holding a mic, and I don't see it as a barrier to having a real talk, as much as the cultural barriers that we have.
You just said you didn't have to.
Yeah?
So
All right, great.
still,
Okay. Great. So let's say, please use it if you're comfortable. Default to using it, and if for whatever reason you don't want to, then that's fine too.
or right there. That's fine. Circle, I guess. I can say what I'm hearing.
Yeah, please do. Do you want a mic? Do you want a not mic? Great.
Either way. So the reason I'm curious in this is because I
eventually would like to have children, and I want to stay home while they're 0 to 3, ideally 0 to 5. Yeah. But I'm also someone who is not going to want to stay home for the duration of their upbringing, and like I will want to come back into the workforce. And for women, it tends to be a trend of, you know, are we able to come back at the same level in which we left is a question mark.
Indeed.
Or if if a company has inclusive policies, there's research that shows women who come back after motherhood are actually better in some ways.
Yeah,
but
I would
what
say don't come back
opportunities?
at the same level. I think, you know, my goal when I was coming back, and part of the reason it took me some time is because I wasn't stagnant in those 7 years that I was primarily focused on other things. I grew faster in those 7 years than I did at other times.
Yep.
So I wanted to come back as if I had continued in the engineering world and continued to grow in salary and responsibility.
Yep.
And I would challenge you to look for that same thing.
Oh, no, that's my plan.
Yeah, 3 years later, be 3 years higher in the responsibilities that you're expecting.
Can I push on that a little bit?
In a moment, I'd love for you to continue with your framing of, you know, having kids and 3 years later and coming back into the workforce.
So a lot of the ways that I'm driving my work now
Yeah.
and trying to shape my role is geared towards preparing for that in a sense. So in my role, I talk a lot about culture, remote work, hiring, and those sorts of things. And also, I'm starting to speak on behalf of my company on some of those other issues like education and accreditation and what does that look like. And so my intention is to do that. And when I do take time to be home, to continue writing. Maybe I'm writing more thought pieces and posting them in different places, getting articles posted. Maybe that's when I'm writing a book. And so that I'm staying relevant to the conversation as it's unfolding while I'm at home. And then
Thank
so they
you.
can come back. Like, that's my plan. We'll see how that goes. But yeah.
I'm curious if Landa is serving any mothers as well, and if there are people who are brushing up their skills so that they can maybe get a remote tech job while they're raising small people.
Yeah, I think right now, as a startup, we're actually very family-centered.
Yeah.
Most folks are married with 3 or more children, which is very different for most startups. And so we try to think of policies that are supportive of parents. And our CEO just actually posted a blog post around parents and work. But internally, that's a question, right? We've had several people take parental leave. We had just our first mother have one, and so we'll see how that goes. But the way we've designed our parental leave is so that they have X amount of time that they can take whenever during the first year, but they can pick and choose when they want to come back or not come back for that. And so they're still like in our communities and still up on things. We just don't expect them to be working. So it'll be curious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is that number of X weeks or X months?
I believe right now we give 3 months off, and you can pick and choose and deploy them in 1 month chunks.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I'm interested in finishing up the group interest, but I do have your like topic of coming back to, like, leaving the workplace and coming back to it. But this is a conversation. Do you all want to dive into whether when you leave the workforce and come back to it, you should be at a new level, or do you want to, you know, see potentially more threads to pull from other folks' interests?
I can explore the level.
Yeah, I'm interested in both.
I'm interested to hear, besides that, what their story is for coming here and what are the themes.
Yeah, that's how I'm leaning as well. So let's finish up introductions and interests, and then we have that as a topic, and maybe we'll have more topics by then too.
I can go. I'm also pursuing, I would say, or if you would have asked me 10 years ago whether I would be doing what I'm doing today, like, it would not be something that I would even like, not even like, it's not a matter of like dare to imagine, it would just like be so out of like where I thought I'm going to end up being that it would be just super bizarre. So I started my career as a software engineer as well, but kind of went through like a pretty gradual process over the last 20 years of kind of like realizing that I like the people puzzles a lot more than the technical puzzles. and 4 years ago, kind of decided to like fully cross over to the dark side and join the people team fully, rather than kind of like poking sticks from the outside or kind of like doing our own thing within R&D, which is often kind of like an anti-pattern that happens when you don't have the leadership and the people function that you need. Been doing that for the last kind of like 4 years or so, and this year decided to take a year off, not kind of explore this sort of like transformational career change, maybe similar to what you've done, but more just realizing that I need the break and that there are other things in life that I value that I don't want to postpone any further, and like I want to create space for that, and I'm willing to take the hit, so to speak, like professionally, because that stuff matters more. It's also it's unlikely that I'm going to come back in like the same role that I have done in the past, not because it's not going to be available to me, just because I've learned more about myself in my recent role and in my time away to seek like a slightly different shape to kind of contribute value. So hence my kind of like curiosity as somebody that's not kind of, oh, I'm a software engineer and I will ever be a software engineer and this is kind of like who I am, that have a much more fluid perception to my career, and I don't need a certain like title to feel a sense of worth. So it's just, that's curious about other people who have a similar experience and kind of their journeys. Yeah.
Thanks. That sense of worth,
Yeah.
I definitely have things to say about that.
My name is Caroline Santiago.
Caroline, are you open to using that?
Yeah, totally. Hi. My name is Caroline Santiago. I'm a global executive coach and a human capital advisor. So my background is working 20 years in the Big Four, then my own consultancy, coaching and consultancy for the past 6. And the reason why I chose this particular topic, which I find very, very fascinating, is from taking a break and the way that our global landscape and our own biases in the workplace now, taking a break sometimes may be seen in a negative light, and then coming back and the whole re-entry, you obviously have a very good story, you had really good skills, networking, you did all these different things to kind of like master that, to get back in the workplace. But I find this, like yourself, a lot of people are doing it, and it's kind of like the reinvention of yourself, because when you take that space, you discover more things about yourself. But in the traditional like corporate structure and the way it is, it's very difficult to navigate that reinvention and telling that story, because you have one set of skills and expertise. Like if you were to look at your story, software engineer and then like dance, most people traditionally would be like, there is no correlation. Those are completely polar opposites of each other. I particularly think that they're very similar because dance is very technical. Like once you have the foundational skills that are really, really good, then you can kind of be creative in dance any way, which way you are, because I know a lot about dance. And that's the way with like software development principles. You have to actually know like functionality, like the structure and the technicality to be really good and creative in the programming, right? Like to get really creative. But this whole notion of so many different people are evolving, and how are they making those pivots and those reinventions and those stories to come back to the workforce, and wanting to hear a little bit more about like other people's strategies and like what does that process look like, and what does success look like in terms of the way that people have done it. And you've obviously successfully done that, so maybe I missed some of that, but I find that very fascinating, because the way that work is being done is completely different now. And then just like as Josh Bernson said, like we're now going from like basically the impact of the workforce, and then a lot of this research that he's done that I've studied is more the human experience. So that crossover from like what you said, you're like, I'm, like in this company, this is the role that I have, but I also want to be a mother. So that's an extension of the human experience. So how do we incorporate all those pivots and or reinventions to still come back like ahead 3 years later? Or like, what does that look like, and how do you feel about the current landscape, and how do you overcome those biases? Did that make sense?
It did. Thank you.
I think there's a lot in there. On the point that I would make is more on like the taking time off to reinvent yourself as well. Because I only took 8 months off between when I was at Hack Reactor before I joined Y Combinator, and the reason I did that was because I was just like burnt out. I was working 14, 16-hour days, 6 days a week. Never could take a break. It was just like, it was too much to the point where it took me a month to really like unwind. And what I've found for my own self and then others that I know who've taken off breaks, it's all about the narrative of the why. And so it's different if someone is, what? Oh, yeah, like, I couldn't agree more. Okay, because it's the narrative, and it's also about like how you are framing it and telling people, and like from the get-go, and then how do you shape that to what you want to do. Because it's like, I've met people, they're like, oh, hey, like, good to meet you. Like, what are you doing? Like, oh, I don't have a job right now. And you're like, okay, that's great, okay. And the other people are like, oh, yeah, I don't have a job right now. Like, even that intonation change is going to alter how someone's going to perceive that. Like, oh, you don't have a job right now. Tell me more. What are you doing with your time? And like, actually, I'm getting more into yoga and meditation because I would like to learn more about myself. And so it's all about... Even
that assumption of what do you do right now? Or what do you do? Like, well, I do hundreds of things. Are you asking what my job is? Or what do you really want to know? And you like that people go straight from what do you do to I don't have a job right now is like, but of course you have lots of things you do. You must.
Yeah. Or not. Who knows?
Or maybe you're... But or not. Then is this the first time you've left the house in...
So that's what I think. It's about how you shape that narrative, not only for your own self, so you recognize that like why you took this time. If you took it purposely, it's like, I took it for this, and I'm working towards this. Or maybe you're working towards figuring it out, and that's totally fine. But then when you get into maybe re-entering the workforce, sometimes people ask, like, oh, I see a gap in your resume. Can you tell me about that? That's when you get to share about this amazing time you got to take off, and let them know what you did with that time. Even if that is... I spent that time figuring out who I am, and now I know this is what I want. Like, oh, I like that.
I did shadow work. I raised a toddler. I traveled the world. There are lots of great answers to that question, and I almost wish that we encouraged people institutionally, and that's sort of the assertion of the title of this, and something I want is from a business perspective for us to be encouraging people to take that year or those 2 years or those 3 years and start businesses, have side hustles, raise their families, travel the world, do personal work, and then come back as more rich, grounded people.
In a way, like if you're ever interviewing someone that did have a gap in time and you ask about it and be like, oh, what did you learn during that time?
I want to see growth mindset in all of my employees, especially the ones who have taken some time to grow in ways that they didn't feel like they could in the context of a given role. And then when they come back, they often are looking, like I was, looking for something different than what they left. You leave as an engineer and you come back as an engineering manager, or you come back excited about HR, and that would be a hard pivot even without the gap. And then with the gap and the pivot, it gets that much harder.
I feel like in some ways, for the people who have left and are then understand the value of having time off to figure out other parts of yourself, right, and develop new skills and surprise yourself of the new direction that you're going. I think for those of us who have that experience, it's easy to see it in other people who are maybe going through the same experience, and actually have more empathy when you know that someone doesn't have a job and they're struggling and they're trying to find direction. Like, you kind of have faith that you were there before, and so you know what big transition is coming for them. But then if your hiring manager or your whole team are people who have only stayed,
traditional path.
Yeah. Then, and they're so afraid they're the people who don't understand why someone would ever take time off because they have so much. I think many of them are just afraid of the uncertainty of leaving and coming back, what did that look like. I think it's hard for them to make that translation because there's that bias, right?
Would would you want to work in an organization that doesn't value that? No. So like, I guess my take is
Wait,
that,
would you want to work in an organization that doesn't value what?
like taking time off, or so to speak, like career gaps.
I think almost everyone works in an organization that doesn't value that.
I don't. I'm saying, like not all organizations are like that.
No. So the reason why I posed that question.
Where do
is-
you work, and are they hiring?
Well, the reason why I posed that question is I've been in over 100 companies. So I've seen a lot, and I've worked specifically in talent management and like the onboarding, the hiring process. So I always find this really, really fascinating, the correlation with the more traditional companies and the lack of infrastructure and the biases versus the really innovative new companies that are actually outliers that really believe in like the time off and like come back and like reinvent yourself. So that's really why I asked the question. Systemically, like what can we do as individuals, like leading or having impact, like what you said, being able to kind of push like our authority or our, like that open mindedness and push those really tough recruiting conversations or those employment conversations with our authority to get people on board and have that growth mindset and those transitions, those periods that they did take time off is a good thing versus like most people, like you said, if they don't have the experience, may not necessarily be open and have their own biases because traditional work structures are like, you're a slacker, like you had to go figure yourself out, like what are you figuring out, like what does that mean, and not really understanding the value of that transition, and then maybe the experience and the wisdom that you bring and the insight.
Please pull up a chair if
that
you'd like
you
to join our
bring
conversation.
to better
Just grab
off
it.
the
Drag it.
organization. So.
If you
So
would
I
fill
really
in
liked
this
your
spot, I'd
perspective,
really
and I'm
appreciate
totally
it.
like, so I just, because I work with a lot of companies that don't value it, period. Like literally, like we try to reinvent like the recruiting process in terms of like how they hire, what they're looking at, what they skills, and those really tough conversations. And it always goes back to like skill, competency, biased, subjective, like what I feel about that person.
Can you give me some ratios? Like you've worked with about 3 times as many companies as I have, so I'm curious what the ratio is among the ones who would encourage that kind of absence and embrace it, and the ones that would run screaming from that.
So very similar to what Brian said about like the companies that really embrace holacracy, like they're already innovative, they're already there. So in this marketplace, I would say 25% are actually open, 75% because you're having to rebuild the whole infrastructure of the way that you recruit and bring talent on. So you have to really like the whole process, the training, the thinking, like how you get people to look at different things in the conversations. And it's actually costs a lot of money to rebuild that process. And then the training to get people to open up their minds. So 25% I would say like are open, on board, early adopters. And then we still have 75% that are still like, we'll make this tweak or this tweak and we'll check a box because it costs so much money to actually, like what he said, to like adopt that change.
Yeah.
So if that's helpful.
Yeah, it feels like 80-20 to me, so that's in the same ballpark. But I see that you have a couple of really strong conflicting opinions, and I'd love to hear a couple of them.
That's what I always do, but
That's okay. I like
Yeah.
that challenging thought process.
Me too. I'd rather have discourse and different opinions and conflict and talk through it. Yeah,
It makes us better thinkers.
indeed.
I guess I would say, so let me take a step back. I think that like, as somebody that has run recruiting teams and did my best to kind of make it the best recruiting process even within the constraints, I would say recruiting, and especially the larger you go as a process, is just fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
Like, and it starts.
I
And
agree.
it starts in the initial match. Right?
Yeah.
Like, your resume tells nothing about you as a
Yes,
person
yes.
and whether you're a good fit for this role. And you reading the job description gives you 0 data on whether this is going to be the right fit for you.
Yeah.
So I guess as a job seeker, the advice that I always give, and it's like I give it as somebody who's run recruiting teams, is hack the process, which is never submit resumes, never write cover letters. It's
Non-traditional.
all about
Networking.
find the hiring manager, get to the hiring manager,
Good tip.
get time with the hiring manager, and have them like see your full human and learn for real what this role is about.
So are you Are you, because a lot of times you don't even know which hiring manager is hiring. And so how do you actually even spend your time? I guess it goes back to your point. It's like identifying the very few companies that you want to work for and then network your way. Whether they have a position open and suitable for you or not doesn't really matter. It's just developing a relationship. Is that what you're saying?
That's part of it. I think that really helps. I guess I would say...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I hate mic sounds. There's an abundance of opportunities out there, right? Like you go on every career site and there's like a ton of them. And I think every time that I find myself in a place where I needed to look for like the next opportunity, the thing that was hardest for me was like dealing with overwhelm. It's like, oh, this looks interesting and this looks interesting and this looks interesting. That might be it. And I think that's another challenge with the recruiting process, that it's like too easy to drop your resume. It's like, oh, I'll just give it a go, right? It like almost like gives me an easy out to like go and do my research and say, hey, do I really believe in this, what this company does? Like, is this really the right role for me? I think.
Yeah. And then like the challenge when job searching, because we talked about that earlier, I think is to maybe you go through the official channels and then your homework starts. And it's not about getting far enough to get the resume in and get the cover letter written. It's really getting clear about why I'm excited about this company and what I have to offer them, and then finding the people who want to hear that.
But like the one hack that I would say also around like informational interviews and kind of building those relationships. People, I think we all are like, we like to talk about ourselves. So it's a much, if you were to send an email to me and say, hey, I'm like really interested in the company, I want to learn more about it, and it's like about you, I'd be a little bit more reluctant to give you my time. But if you're saying like, hey,
I like this, that you've done this,
I want to hear about
love
your
this.
story, right? Like, how did you end up in this company? What career path have you pursued? I found that people are a lot more open to give me their time when I make it about them. And I get the same information. Right? It's a much easier to like get my friend.
And after 20 minutes, they're like, so why are you interested in this? And then you have the same conversation that you would have had otherwise, and you have a lot more to go on. Maybe sometimes after those 20 minutes of me hearing about them and what they're excited about, I realize that I don't actually want to work for this company. And then my answer to them is very different than what I would have said if we had started with the context of I'm looking for a job.
Edgar, I have a question. I don't know if this is for you. I mean, anyone could answer it. Do you have any tactics that you would employ for pitching how creative work has served your growth? Like, for example, in my company now, I've taken almost an exclusive content creation role. I host a podcast and do a lot of writing. How would you pitch a creative role? I mean, it could be dance, any sort of creative role. How would you tactically pitch that as, I guess, a piece of value in your growth?
Sure. I'd love to hear anybody else's perspective on this as well, because I think this is very close to home for me. And for me personally, what my creative expression does in support of my marketplace value is really making me a more well-rounded human, making me more grounded and present, giving me the better skills to engage and connect in a personal way with all of my customers, because I'm working in a customer-facing role, or with my team if I was working in a team role. But it doesn't have a place on my resume per se, because all of that will come out in the human interactions around the interviewing process. The things that I speak to on the resume are about like the hard skills, the technical skills that I got in the context of that. So throwing events of a given size, organizing teams of a given size, hiring, training, mentoring, pedagogy, all of those things that I did in the support of the creative work.
Awesome. And I think stepping out of the traditional hierarchy, I mean, I came from a sales and development background in my real job. And then I don't know what to call it anymore.
I call it a day job, because everything that I did with with teaching and promoting partner dance felt so much more real than my 10 years working in IT.
Yeah.
It touched people in a very real way, both literally and in a way that changed their life paths. You know, I had people take a lesson or spend a weekend training on dance and then leave their jobs, leave their partners, move to different cities, change their life path. So I think referring to like a 9-to-5 or a corporate job as real work invalidates the validity and importance of emotional labor and all of the things that I believe in my heart of hearts about art and why it matters.
Yeah. Well, I think that starting a company is a really good way to use as a vehicle to get into a different type of work. I mean, no one, being from sales and development, I found in starting my own company that it was very much about putting people in the right places, and that was something that I enjoyed more than sales and development. I think without creating that opportunity for myself, it would have been a lot harder to get there in a traditional structure.
Yeah, totally. When I was working as an artist, I was always teaching something, you know, teaching was a big part of what I did. And all over, people of a variety of cultures and lots of backgrounds and age ranges. So there's always something that I was teaching at an overt level. And then there were the covert things that I was sneaking in. And the overt thing was almost always some element of dance or partnering, musicality, and sometimes, you know, human skills of listening, empathy. And then the covert things were good humaning, like how to adjust how you were interacting with people relative to this person or this person or this person, how to wait, how, you know, so I was always doing both of those levels. And I think that still matters in the context of other work. You know, you have your overt message and your covert message.
Can I offer a perspective?
Oh, please.
Yes.
There are two kind of like misperceptions that you're fighting when you're kind of coming off, like, or you're coming from like a non-traditional background, whatever that is. One is sort of trying to convince that kind of like all of the things that like might be perceived as irrelevant actually make you more qualified to do the job. I think that's the harder one to change. So my advice would be, don't even go there. Like the other perception that you're trying to change is that by having the non-traditional background, like you are less qualified on the criteria that's already there, like the technical criteria, on the face criteria. And I think that that's a perception that's a lot easier to change by willing to do the hard work. So I do think that like opting to pursue a like less conformist career path, like it has a cost associated with it. And like I think we should like own that cost. Like we should not advocate for it to be zero. Because we did it also to serve things like serve us and like don't serve organizations.
Yeah. There was a hard cost for me of stepping away from an engineer salary for 7 years to work as an artist, like, and at a cost in dollars. And there was also compensation in terms of all the lives that I touched and changed and all the connections that I made. It was from a, I forget the exact framing that you used, but there was something that you said earlier about like self-image and self-worth.
Yeah.
And I still bought in at some level to the idea that my self-worth as a man had something to do with the work that I was doing in the world and how I was being valued and compensated for that work. So, you know, losing a 0 on my compensation level was hard emotionally. And I had to continually remind myself that the change and all of the life experience that I was getting from it that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise is another compensation. But it took me like 3 years of patient faith and confronting that self-worth thing before I got to a place that I was really happy with.
Yeah. And I was saying, like, one of the other more maybe tactical costs is that I'm going to have to work harder to connect the dots. Right? In like any sort of...
Does anybody know whose bag that is?
I'm going to have to work harder to like connect the dots. That like somebody that's coming from like a traditional kind of like, that's so easy to pattern match. And like I need to be willing to like do the heavy lifting to like connect the dots, right? And like spoon feed them and like
I have to tell the story.
Above and beyond
Right.
what like a typical candidate would do to show how I check all those boxes.
What's my through line? And am I really qualified for this job? How do I demonstrate that?
One thing that I've seen put that on my resume. You say like, so if I'm perusing, it's like, was that this company is like, and I was like, and they'll like say what they did or learned during that time. And so then maybe that's one way, right? Instead of submitting your resume with only your work experience, because like, why is it, we can craft our resume to be whatever. We don't have to have the title say work experience. It could be like experience, and that's a whole lot of other things, right? And so that, maybe that's a lightweight way to take that upon yourself, the ownership of like, I took this time off, but like, let me tell you about it up here. I'm not withholding it. Here's what I did.
No, I'm saying like, I think I take it upon myself to like take a much more proactive stance and like showing the work. And I think part of it is like free labor, like not, you know, hey, I'm gonna come work for you, like not full kind of like apprenticeship, right? But like figuring out some way in the interview process to like demonstrate that I can do the job, even when I'm doing like outreach.
Yeah.
Like,
Are you done? Yeah. Just to add to your good point, so I think the way you're trying to demonstrate, I coach around this a lot, is, to your point as well, is when you are trying to sell new work, when you're trying to get a job, trying to get a date, all these other life things, basically things come down to the way that human experience and the way that someone experiences you. So number one, the brain like looks and like senses your competence. So if you're going to try to get into a job, you have to have the expertise, or you need to be really competent at that job technically, like what your resume shows.
Absolutely.
And then there's the confidence. So like being able to show up really, really confident about your expertise and who you are and why you made those pivots or why you made those decisions. Because what happens is when people feel your apprehension or your insecurity about it, then they're like, you're not that good. The other thing that I learned from my mentor, Marshall Goldsmith, number one executive coach in the world, that he says quite often, his answer to this question would be, you didn't show your value. So in any given situation, it's really, really important to kind of assess what the interviewer, the date, whatever, you think that they are trying to get at. What is their question? Like, listen, deeply listen, and try to understand, like, what are they trying to ask of you to convey to them? And when you give your answer, be able to quickly show value and insight to their specific answers. So what a lot of people don't, so 9 times out of 10, he'll say, you know, a lot of people go and they say to Marshall, they'll be like, okay, when I did this interview or I tried to sell this piece of work, I didn't get it. He was like, quite frankly, you didn't show your value. So being able to understand in those interactions, you need to quickly assess whoever is like rating you, interviewing you, like date, whatever, work, whatever situation, and be able to show your value. And usually, like, if you show your value, then you will quickly like get hired and or asked, you know, to stay in connection or whatever. So I hope that helps. That's to what you said.
Have some time
Yeah.
for you to participate and share with us why you're
We're
here.
actually wrapping up the session in a couple of minutes. So I appreciate your sentiment, and I'm so glad that you joined us.
And I stumbled in this section. I'm delighted to be here, and it's been interesting. And I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
And
but I take it you were the gentleman who left your career for a period of time that they were introducing at the end of the
Indeed.
holacracy. Okay.
Yeah.
And I meant to go to the remote one, and I'm glad I ended up here.
You're in the right room, but that was the last session.
Oh, I'm just late. But you know what? Sometimes things work out. And I've learned some things. So thanks, guys.
I'm glad you're here.
And I really like what you said about confidence. And I think it comes back to what you said, even the way that you say it in the interview. It's like, oh, yeah, I took some time off. You're already portraying it as being, you know, that you fucked up in some way, or that it's not a valuable experience. But if you come at it from a point like, yeah, I had this experience, you're already showing a certain degree of value in whatever it was that you were doing.
So just the research behind that, if you're curious, so Brendan Bashar, he is like the number one, well, he's under Tony Robbins, number one motivational like speaker, second to Tony Robbins, who's actually 40 years old, amazing. Brendan Bashar, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. So he did $1 million research on high performance habits. There's 6. He studied millionaires, billionaires, Olympic athletes, and the number one high performance habits amongst all these most successful people is confidence. And I really like his definition of confidence. It is the ability in any given situation to have the complete like worth and or belief in yourself that you can figure out the problem and find a solution. So if it's creatively, whatever, but it's that rock solid belief, like I got this in any like situation.
And
So that's research based. That's number one. So
in the context of engineering hiring, that it's always struck me how job descriptions are often written with X years of experience with this tool, and the trope is that they'll list like 5 to 10 years of experience with a tool that's 3 years old. So it's not actually possible to have that experience, that level of experience, and you know it happens pretty frequently that those job descriptions are being written in a way that doesn't actually reflect what people really need to do the job. And then my understanding and belief about engineering and design is that you learn a process. And a lot of that involves changing tools. Can I use that tool? No. Can I learn that tool? Absolutely. Can I learn it quicker than the average person? Yes. Have I demonstrated that in my career? Also, yes. Could I do the same thing with an imperfect tool? And I actually think that's my bar for professionalism. If you can produce top quality results with inferior tools.
but that's competence, and high confidence, right? So that
I don't know
actually
about
goes with both.
that the confidence is necessary in that, and I do like your story, and I think that I've met people that would meet that level, that definition of professionalism, that are very humble and insecure about the quality of their work, and
Interesting.
Especially in the technical side, I think some of our best engineers are, I wouldn't describe them as confident.
yeah.
Outwardly confident.
But
I see it in the arts
confidence
too.
is-
I see it in like cooks and dancers who are unbelievable in the results that they produce, even with inferior tools, who still talk about their work as if it's second or third tier when it's actually first tier.
Interesting. Fascinating.
I think it's interesting because I can see that my brother is an awesome artist. He kind of works at Marvel and like crazy, but he's a confident person. But I think there's a side where you're always afraid you're not good enough, and that's what really like drives you. You're always looking at your competitors and other artists and so I don't know if the nervousness comes from that, and I think that is really healthy. But then there is a different kind of insecurity where you are just not confident about your self-worth, and you're tying your whole worth to whether you have that job, whether you're making a certain amount of money, whether other people, how other people see you. That type of insecurity, nervousness is I think like different from the desire to always like be better.
That is absolutely an entirely separate session.
But I like that you broke that down because it really makes sense. Because the confidence I was talking about is the actual like the ability within yourself to know in any given situation to be able to figure it out. So it is tied to self-worth in terms of like in any given situation, like I can figure this out. But it's not necessarily like a lack of humility. It's just the creative process. Like, oh, I can figure this out. Like, let's talk this through or whatever.
It's a completely different axis.
Yeah.
But there's also overconfidence. So anything you take to the extreme, you end up
That's
with
me.
a suboptimal outcome.
Oh my God, this is
Like that's Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like, I got this, but like I'm actually clueless and incompetent, and that causes harm as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I feel like different, right? It's like knowing, like, I'm very confident in certain areas of my life, and other areas I'm like,
Situational. Yeah.
don't
Yeah,
know.
that's a really good point.
And so I think, so like in the context of going into an interview for a job that we think that we are qualified for, or like maybe overqualified for, maybe that's a different confidence area. Whereas I'm like, I'm gonna go fix this car right now. Like I am definitely not confident that that's gonna be successful. I can get the tire off the thing if I like jump on the jack a lot. Like I'm confident I can do that, but so that's different. So I think it's contextual confidence. Yeah.
I want to wrap things up there. We're a few minutes over time. We have about 15 minutes of transition until Robin does closing remarks downstairs at 10 after. So thank you all for dropping by.